policy that brings in £55 million less than forecast is a good one?
First Minister.
Well, I am assuming that Ruth Davidson is referring to LBTT, the property tax that was introduced when powers transferred to this Parliament. Revenues raised in the most recent financial year, 2016-17, were actually 14% higher than the revenues raised in the previous year. The revenues raised were, yes, indeed lower than forecast, but that is not something that is in any way unique to Scotland. If we look, for example, at the corresponding tax in the rest of the UK stamp duty, the revenue raised there was some 8% lower than the OBR forecast. These issues are mainly because it is very difficult to predict transaction taxes, but of course the revenues raised also reflect the general economic conditions, property prices generally, and as the Fiscal Commission said in relation to LBTT, the situation in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire.
Ruth Davidson.
I was indeed talking about LBTT, and let's go through the numbers for Scotland. The Scottish Government expected £538 million to come from LBTT, and in the end, only £483 million came in, a shortfall of 55. That was, according to property experts, due to a considerable drop in activity because of this tax. Now, let's see if we can get some clarity here from the First Minister. Early in the summer, her Finance Secretary said this. He said, and I'll quote directly, "I'm not an ideologue on this issue. We want the tax to function well, and if there's a case that an amendment of the current bans could help stimulate the housing market and the revenue it raises, then I will consider it." With a £55 million shortfall and a housing market, again, and I'll quote, "in serious slowdown," hasn't that case now been made?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, of course, we will bring forward our tax decisions in our budget to be scrutinised by Parliament for this and for all taxes for which we are responsible. But let's get into the detail of Ruth Davidson's question here, because she talks about a shortfall, £483 million raised in 2016-17, as I said, was actually 14% higher than the revenues raised in the previous year. That's more revenue being brought into use for public spending. Secondly, Ruth Davidson somehow wants to give the impression that a shortfall against a revenue forecast is somehow uniquely to do with the structure of the tax in Scotland. Perhaps she wants to therefore explain why, as I said, on a like-for-like basis, there was an 8% shortfall in the rest of the UK compared to the OBR forecast. But let's get into the heart of the suggestions that Ruth Davidson is making, because the claim here is that this is due to the rates of tax at the top end of the property market. Unfortunately for Ruth Davidson, who, as we've seen in recent weeks, doesn't always do her homework around the issues she raises at First Minister's questions, the facts tell a different story. I mean, let's look at data to the end of August this year. Sales of properties between £325,000 and £750,000 are up by 14% annually. Sales above £750,000 are up by 10% annually. The monthly revenues for August of this year in both of these property brackets were at the highest levels ever since LBTT was introduced. So transactions, and this is an additional bit of information just to inform Ruth Davidson, transactions and revenues at the top of the market are actually maintaining their share of the overall market. So yes, predicting transaction tax revenue is notoriously difficult to do, and that's shown not just in Scotland but south of the border. But revenues in the year we're talking about are up on the previous year, and the claims Ruth Davidson is making about the top end of the market are simply not borne out by the facts. Why can't she just concede that and perhaps do a bit more research and homework in future?
Ruth Davidson.
The First Minister does excel in trying to pretend to answer a question that wasn't asked. But let's talk about homework. If the First Minister had done her homework, she would have listened to Nicola Barclay, who's the Chief Executive of Home for Scotland. I'm going to read out, this is quite a lengthy quote, so I hope I've got latitude from the first two short questions, Presiding Officer. As we have expressed in submissions to the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament, if we are to have a healthy and well-functioning housing market, we need a tax framework that enables movement up and down all price levels. However, feedback from our members shows that the present system, which varies considerably from that south of the border, is creating significant barriers. And here's the thing, Presiding Officer. The SNP was warned repeatedly that this would happen. Organisations like the Scottish Property Federation made it clear that these tax rates would gum up the market and reduce revenues, and that is exactly what happened. This week, a specific proposal has been put on the table. A specific proposal has been put on the table this week by Homes for Scotland. They want to make it easier for families to move up the property ladder and proposing to extend the 5% band to help them. I'll back that proposal, will she?
First Minister.
We will bring forward tax proposals in our budget. That's the right and proper way to proceed. But let me just pick up on a few things Ruth Davidson said there. Firstly, I'm not sure what question she was asking me if it wasn't the one I answered. I gave her a very, very detailed answer to her question. And the point is, and I don't want to repeat everything I've just said, but what Ruth Davidson is saying here is not borne out by the facts. I've just quoted figures that show that property sales, transactions in these brackets at the top of the property market are not declining, as Ruth Davidson says. They are actually increasing by 14% and 10% respectively. That is an increase, not a decrease. So the whole premise of Ruth Davidson's question, it seems to me, has crumbled before her very eyes. But here we get also, I think, to a broader issue here, and it's one that has surfaced at discussion in First Minister questions in recent weeks. Yet again, we have, day after day after day, week after week after week, Tory members coming to this chamber, sometimes declaring their business interests, sometimes not declaring their business interests, calling for extra spending, and yet here again we have the Tories also calling for a cut in tax for the very wealthiest in our society. The sums for the Tories simply don't add up. So firstly, Ruth Davidson is wrong in her central claims today, and yet again the Tories have been found absolutely wanting. They want us to spend more, but they also want us to cut taxes, and they cannot have the best of both worlds.
Ruth Davidson.
First Minister referring to Tory MP Alexander Burnett.
I don't even know how you lot are going to pick through all of the things that weren't said that have been claimed there. But let's go back to the numbers. Let's go back to the actual
All right,
numbers.
order. Mr Swinney, please. Mr Swinney. Ms Davidson knows that you refers to the chair, not to the press gallery.
Absolutely. Let's get back to the numbers, because the First Minister says that this went up, not down. But the embarrassment for the SNP is that the shortfall would have been much worse if they hadn't adopted wholesale the Tory proposal for the new surcharge on buy-to-let and second homes. So she talks about raising revenue. There was £100 million right there. That's not their idea. That was ours. So on the very first new tax administered by the government, the First Minister has got it completely wrong. She gummed up the housing market. She blew a £55 million hole in her own budget, which would have been 3 times worse if she hadn't picked up the Tory policy on buy-to-let and second homes. And more importantly, and this is the important bit, she squeezed Scottish families out of their first proper home. Does that sound like competency to her?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, you can always tell when Ruth Davidson is floundering at First Minister's questions when she starts hurling abuse across the chamber. Although it's nothing on the abuse that was hurled at me and others by the Tory councillor, of course, who was taken off the teaching register because of her behaviour, something that Ruth Davidson probably won't want to comment on. But I'm not sure what bit of this Ruth Davidson is struggling to understand. I should say, in terms of people at the bottom of the housing ladder, people actually looking to own their first home, we've reduced the tax burden because we've made LBDT more progressive than stamp duty ever was. But then progressive taxes is something that's clearly offensive to people on the Tory benches. But, you know, what we've got here is a situation where LBTT revenue is up compared to the year before. That's up, not down. We've got the situation where transactions at the top of the market are up, not down. Again, that's up, not down. So, you know, the whole premise of Ruth Davidson's question here is absolutely flawed. We will continue to put forward proposals that are progressive in nature, help those most in need of help at the bottom, and make sure that those with the broadest shoulders pay a fair share. I know that principle of progressive tax, as I say, is something that Tory benches don't like, but it's one that those of us in this bench, these benches will continue to adhere to.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.